significant former and present members of our community to share their insights. I am pleased to recognize this afternoon our esteemed panelists. Professor Emeritus Edward Baugh will provide some insight from his perspective on teaching and learning in the early years. Former Regional Director of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Professor Emerita Barbara Bailey, will take us through the journey of the development of gender studies as an academic pursuit at the UWI. Our former Guild President, the Honourable Dr. Horace Chang, is not here in his political hat. He's not wearing his political hat today, but he was here as Guild President. In fact, he was my Guild President. And so he will give us a peek into the UWI in the 70s and its impact on students as he saw it then. We apologize for the President of the Guild of Students, Mr. Oshane Grant, who we have just learned is unavoidably absent today. Our former principal, the Most Honorable Professor Sir Kenneth Hall, will speak to his experiences as principal of the Mona Campus during a time of political and social change. And last, but by no means least, our esteemed Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, will bring it all together and he will assess the UWI, 70 years of service, 70 years of leadership, and the future. Each panelist has been asked to speak for 10 minutes. Professor Beckles has a little longer, I think, 15 to 20 minutes, Prof. And following his address, we will open the floor to the audience to ask questions and to engage our panelists and make your own contributions of your experiences at the UWI. We do hope you will enjoy the evening, and for some of us, it will be quite reminiscent of what took place then. At this time, I do invite now our principal, the host of this function, our Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor the Honourable Archibald MacDonald, to offer his welcome to you. Please welcome Professor MacDonald.
Thank you, Dr. Bell-Hutchinson, our esteemed panelists, present and past leaders of the University of the West Indies, our students, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the UWI Mona 70 Commemorative Forum. It is indeed fitting to convene a forum marking the 70th anniversary during our annual University Research Days. Over the past 70 years, the UWI has undoubtedly made significant contributions to academic research in the arts, social sciences, and applied sciences. We have paved the way in supporting the economic, social, political, and cultural development and advancement of Jamaica, as well as the wider Caribbean. We have produced some of the region's most forward-thinking scholars and practitioners who have helped to shape our continued growth as a regional community and advance how our society interacts on the international stage. It is therefore fitting to reflect on many of our achievements during a campus-wide event that celebrates academic exploration, innovation, and research geared at supporting the development of our society. This evening, panel is comprised of government officials, a representative, hopefully, Oshane's person deputizing for Oshane will be here with us. And some of the UWI's most distinguished academic researchers and practitioners. And they're all from a variety of fields, and they will give their unique insights into the significance of UWI's contribution over 70 years. We will examine the past and future contributions of the UWI and discuss how we can continue to aid in the growth, stability, and advancement of Jamaica and the Caribbean region. As a leading higher learning institution, we recognize that we have laid a formidable foundation in education for Jamaica, but we also believe firmly that our best contributions are yet to come. I am therefore intrigued to hear from our distinguished panelists and what they project to be the UWI's contribution over the next 70 years, and the impact that our past contributions have had on today's society. I end by thanking you all for joining us at this public forum, and I encourage everyone to lend their voice to this critical discourse on the past, present, and future importance of the UWI. Many thanks to all of the panelists who agreed to share their thoughts today. I must also thank everyone who have supported the UWI as we continue to strive to maintain our position as Jamaica's and indeed the Caribbean's premier higher learning institution. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy the forum.
Thank you, Principal. We'll hear from the panelists without any further intervention on my part. And so I now invite Professor Edward Baugh to come to the podium. Please welcome Professor Baugh.
Now I know just how old I am. I was asked to say something about the teaching and learning in the early years. And in order to say something about that, I must first explain the context and point of view from which I am able to speak at all on that topic. And what I must stress about that context and point of view is their limitations in more ways than one. In other words, what I am able to say is limited, very limited. My early years in this place didn't begin at the beginning of the institution. They fell a good little bit short of it. I first entered this campus as an undergraduate in October 1954, 6 years after teaching had begun in the Faculty of Medicine, and I entered in arts, the most recent of the three faculties then functioning. Natural sciences had come on stream in 1949. Being necessarily a student in one faculty, my knowledge was limited to the teaching and learning in that faculty. The teaching schedule in arts seemed far less time-consuming than it was in the other faculties. I didn't have classes after lunchtime, or on Saturdays, or public holidays. Yes, there were classes even when we all lived in public holidays. I didn't have long hours of work in labs. Then again, I was struck and in a way saddened by the fact that some medical students who were outstanding in their contribution to extracurricular activities, such as drama, in their pre-med years, had largely to abandon these activities when they entered the second MB stage because their work schedule became so demanding. At least, though, the fact that all students lived on campus in those days, rubbing shoulders in the halls of residence, meant that something must have rubbed off, even by the merest implication, about the teacher-student interaction in faculties other than one's own. I experienced one benefit of this proximity in my very first term, In that term, the results of the final MBBS exams, the first set, were made known. And I can never forget the eruption of joy when the about-to-be doctors rushed out of their rooms to rejoice. And I was saddened by the speechless disappointment of the one or two who hadn't made it. I felt a sense of privilege to know that I could bear witness to a moment when the new University College began to deliver its benefit to the West Indies. To speak about the teaching and learning at UCWI in and around my time necessitates my setting another context by saying something about the remit of the college and the structure of the first degree program, at least in my faculty. In this regard, our colonial inheritance was an informing factor. The British West Indian territories were all still colonies. The UCWI was established by the British as an external college, so to speak, of the University of London, so that the degrees its graduates attained were identified in terms of institution as London-UCWI, such as my degree, IBA. This designation evoked a split response in my mind. On the one hand, there was a smugness at being identified as a product of the Great London, although in a qualified way. On the other hand, there was a somewhat subconscious feeling of falling short of a fully realized local status on ostensibly equal terms with the great outside location. This was a time when the idea of a West Indian Federation was a buzz in the air, and nowhere more so than on the Mona Campus, which was itself then an active example of regional integration. As to the structure and content of the degree programs, those followed naturally from the remit of the college. For instance, what was covered in the BA Honours degree in English that I pursued amounted to the history of the literature of England with a relevant segment on the history of the English language. It was what a student at the University of London would have followed. There was no American literature, and hardly surprising then, no course in West Indian literature. The history department could at least boast of teaching West Indian history. And who were the teachers? Again, not surprisingly, given the moment in time, they were mostly foreigners, mainly British, with a leaven of Europeans and others. The few West Indians then had a special place in my mind. Persons such as Elsa Govaya and Roy Auger in history, Leslie Robinson in mathematics, Francis Bowen in physics, and Harriana Montido in surgery. Rightly or wrongly, they seem generally more approachable than the non-West Indians. In the English department, the faculty then comprised two Englishmen and a Canadian female. It may be predictable that I should tell you that the most friendly of the three was the Canadian. She held tutorials in her West Road flat and served us soft drinks or tea while she had strong. This seems now an appropriate point at which I should quote from someone who preceded me at Mona by 4 years, the St. Lucian Nobel Laureate, Derek Walcott, one of the first students in the Faculty of Arts in 1950 and its most distinguished graduate. In 1993, he was keynote speaker right here in the Assembly Hall. He was keynote speaker in 1993 at the UWI's first ever gathering of graduates. His address, titled "The Land of Look Behind," was not exactly the fondly celebratory reminiscence that may have been anticipated by the audience. Here is one definitive statement from what Walcott said. Quote, "For most of my sentence here," and note the word sentence, "for most of my sentence here, I despised the place. its jaded, predictable curriculum for not being the University of the West Indies, as I watched Englishmen guide the direction in which I should go." End of quote. As you can imagine, the stunned silence of the audience that morning was palpable. An important difference between the early years and now has to do with the system of examining on which the student's degree result was based. In my time, one sat exams at the end of one's first year, and these exams were useful in different ways, among them to decide if one would be accepted into an honors degree program. However, one's degree result then was determined on the basis of the examinations at the end of one's final year, examinations that covered all that one had studied during one's 3 years. One went through one's 3 years under an increasing weight of knowledge that was an anxiety-building burden, but also the consolation there was of a comprehensive grasp of one subject. Today's students might find such a situation unimaginable. Now they clean their slates at the end of each semester and don't have to carry the load of that semester's work over into the next semester's courses. In what form did the teaching and learning proceed? Teaching was carried out in two forms in the Faculty of Arts, lectures and tutorials, much as it still is. The entire class would attend the lectures, while the class was divided, as still happens, into small groups for tutorials in the lecturer's office. Attendance at lectures was not compulsory, but attendance at tutorials was. And indeed, the tutorials were the really valuable part of the teaching. The lectures were sometimes very missable, partly, no doubt, because, like now, they were not so much focused on what essay topics, because unlike now, they were not so much focused on what essay topics and exam questions were likely to be. In some cases, too, the lectures were boring, but the lecturer droned on, seemingly not bothered by the poor attendance, which got poorer week by week. In the case of one of my lecturers, the congenial Canadian, I made sure to be always present out of pity for her by adding, however minimally, to the small attendance. Of course, learning, as it is now, was not just the product of the curricular and classroom interaction of teacher and student. Reading on one's own initiative, outside of what was being talked about in classes, not only enhanced one's performance in the given course, but also broadened one's knowledge and nourished one's curiosity. A factor that contributed to this benefit was that in those days, literature courses were not structured, as they tend to be now, around a list of specific prescribed texts. If, for instance, one was following a course in 19th century literature, there wouldn't be a list of prescribed texts that included, say, one novel by Jane Austen and one by Charles Dickens. One would read as many of their novels as one could manage in preparation for tackling any question or topic on them that might come up. In 1954, coming from Port Antonio, where there was no such thing as a bookstore, I was overjoyed to find myself in a fertile field of books in the library and in Sangster's University bookshop at Ligonier. One of my best memories is of browsing in the library on afternoons after my siesta, especially in the periodical stacks. The Pelican Annual for 1955 carries an item titled "The Student, His Books, and His Bookseller." We'll forgive the gender bias there. Which tells us that, quote, "the fame of Mr. Sangster's bookshop has spread far beyond the shores of Jamaica, and it is well on the way to becoming the premier bookshop of the Caribbean through a mail service," end of quote. I remember the pleasure of my first purchase of a recommended text at Sangster's bookstore at Ligonier. Not even the building exists anymore. In recent years, I became increasingly disheartened to see how little interest in reading most of the students have, and how unwilling to have books of their own, even though reading would be perhaps the most essential factor to their success. For the last course I taught, there was just one prescribed text, the collected poems of the poet being studied, one book. I was surprised to find, as the course went on, how few of them, after we had been more than halfway through the course, owned the one book. They would photocopy from a classmate's book the few poems I was able to talk about in the lectures. That was one consideration that made me finally stop teaching. And that's the point at which I should finally stop talking.
Vice-Chancellor, Principals, Madam Moderator, distinguished fellow panelists, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this 70th anniversary commemorative forum. My presentation, entitled The UWI Gender Project, a Unique and Controversial Achievement, provides a platform for making a bold and indisputable claim. The emergence of gender studies on the UWI landscape as a credible academic enterprise, and the subsequent establishment of the Center Institute for Gender and Development Studies, located outside of established faculty boundaries, has been the most unique and possibly the most controversial innovation at the UWI since its establishment in 1948. The 1975 World Conference on Women and the UN Decade on Women 1975 to 85 sparked global interest in arriving at a better understanding of the situation of women, and triggered the eruption of a maelstrom of women-focused activities in the Caribbean region. Between 1974 and 1984, at least 10 countries had established some form of institutional mechanism within the government apparatus to monitor the situation of women and increase their participation in national development. Women in the University of the West Indies were equally energized, and the immediate outcome was the emergence of the Women and Development Unit, WAND, in 1978, led by Peggy Antrobus, and situated in the extramural department, the then extramural department of the UWI. One explicit objective of this unit was to promote non-sexist approaches to curriculum development and training. The then Institute of Social and Economic Research, ISA, Barbados, also responded promptly to the call for a better understanding of the situation of women in the region. And in October 1979, a research project on women in the Caribbean was launched, led by Joycelyn Masayo of the Barbados unit. A major objective of the project was to generate relevant data for elaborating a cohesive social policy directed towards women, intended to inform the Caribbean development agenda. A unique feature of this project was the profound impact that the highly successful research had on the academic landscape of the UWI. The wealth of information generated and the highly collaborative spirit created generated interest among female academics to explore how best the UWI could be involved in the regional and global thrust of understanding how women fitted into development theory and praxis. This felt need emerged from rank-and-file members of the institution and represented the initiation of an idea that would give rise to an innovation across the UWI landscape, the scope of which could never have been imagined at that point in time. And no time was wasted in beginning to give form to that vision. In March 1982, even before the formal end of the WICP, funding was secured from the Ford Foundation, and WAND, in collaboration with ISA, organized a meeting of scholars held in New York State University to discuss the possible introduction of a Women and Development Studies program at the UWI. A proposal was developed, and the first phase being the establishment of women's studies groups on each campus in order to lay the foundation for the introduction of women's studies as an academic pursuit. This marked the emergence of campus-based women's studies groups between 1982 and 1984 under the aegis of a regional steering committee which met for the first time immediately following the New York meeting in March 1982. A unique feature of these women's studies groups was their lack of legitimate power, and therefore little access to the resources of the institution, forcing them to function outside the mainstream of the academy. By 1984, it became blatantly clear that introducing women's studies in the academy without access to legitimate power would require the administration to play a more significant role if discussions were to move from the periphery to the center. The immediate solution to the lack of legitimate power was to seek financial viability by gaining economic power from sources outside of the institution. In 1985, significant funding was sought from the government of the Netherlands through a project of cooperation in teaching, research, and outreach 1985 to 2000 between the UWI and the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. The proposal was developed by the Regional Steering Committee and the coordinators of the campus women's studies groups and submitted with support from VC Preston to the ISS, the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. One of the stipulations of the Netherlands was that once funding ceased, the UWI would assume full responsibility for the program, which, as envisaged, would be integrated into the existing structure of the university at all levels. This condition immediately triggered alarm among some members of the administration, and a subcommittee of University Planning and Estimates Committee was set up to hold discussions with the innovators and to advise UPEC and ultimately the VC on how to proceed. I will return to this shortly. Suffice it to say that at that meeting with the designers of the project, all women, the members of the subcommittee were not sympathetic to women and development studies or to the proposed program and asked for assurances that it was a project and not a program. Kathleen Drayton described it as a stormy meeting, but with the representatives of the Women in Development Studies holding their own. Ultimately, the project document was revised taking into account some of the suggestions made by UPEC. And on June 6, 1985, VC Preston held audience with Elsa Leorini and Jocelyn Messiah, fortuitously accompanied by Lucille Matthew-Mayer, who was visiting the Mona campus, and he signed a statement of intent formalizing his willing support of a UWI ISS project between 1985 and 2000. Following on stage one of the project, another unique feature of the gender project were our efforts to gain legitimate power. The politics of the integration of women in development studies into the formal structures of the UWI were not readily embraced. In this instance, the charge was led by Elsa Leorini, who had been appointed the first professor of gender and development in 1992 under the watch of PVC Marlene Hamilton, who had responsibility for gender as part of her PVC portfolio. The struggle was real, but the intention to establish women in development studies as an independent entity outside of the entrenched faculty structure was never negotiable. On May 6, 1993, the UPEC accepted the proposal to put forward for establishing an independent entity, but with a suggested name change from Women to Gender and Development Studies, acknowledging the shift away from concerns of women in development to gender and development in the international discourse, and the growing use of gender as an analytical tool in development planning. Institutionalization and the offering of undergrad and postgrad programs brought with it again unique features, shifts in ways of knowledge generation and teaching and learning. Staff and students were exposed to the use of gender as an analytical tool and a lens through which social, economic, and political phenomena could be interrogated, revealing how historically the generation of knowledge had excluded the voice and experience of women. This marked the emergence and the cultivation of an epistemological approach which incorporated women's voices and inserted women's ways of knowing into knowledge production. Similarly, there was a need to promote teaching strategies that valued the experience and voice of students, questioned long-accepted theories and ideologies, accepted multiple truths and realities, and this was also integral to the shift away from a practice of dispensing knowledge to the adoption of a feminist pedagogy for delivery of courses and assessing learning outcomes. A further unique and notable milestone was achieving degree granting status only 15 years after institutionalization. In 2008, the CGDS was upgraded to institute status, and a year later, in 2009, the University Finance and General Purposes Committee, without reservation, agreed that the IGDS should issue its own degrees. In this short span of time, in face of limited institutional support, a fully articulated complement of programs through which students could move seamlessly from a lower-level matriculation diploma through to an undergraduate bachelor's, as well as to the full range of graduate programs, master's, MPhil, and PhDs, had been approved, were on the books, and were being offered. This achievement was nothing short of stellar and pointed to the total passion and commitment of the meager complement of staff across all the campus units. Yet another unique feature of this innovation was the relationships forged with national, regional, and international agencies that relied on the expertise in gender analysis which resided in the Center Institute. These relationships resulted in significant financial inflows to the UWI coffers, which supported research projects and academic programs and provided financial support to students and ultimately were beneficial to the university. The net result of the activities of the IGDS was the output of a cadre of persons with expertise in gender analysis, as well as a plethora of publications which have filled gaps in the global gender and development discourse, have been indispensable for informing national and regional policy positions, and have served as an invaluable resource for regional and international scholars. Madam Moderator, this presentation has highlighted what I regard as unique gains that have accrued from activities that have spawned some 40 of the 70 years of the existence of this institution. In my opinion, the major gain has been the establishment of gender and development studies at the UWI as a legitimate field of study approached with the same rigor as any other reputable area of study, with its unique body of concepts and tools for interrogating the full gamut of human, social, economic, and political issues that impact development planning and programming. An objective yet to be fully realized through the Gender Project at UWI, however, is the challenge to reverse unequal power relations in the academy by disrupting normalized patriarchal attitudes, values, and behaviors. The architects of the Gender Project may have to concede that this is yet an unfinished task, but efforts are ongoing, and hopefully this will be addressed more directly through the recently adopted UWI gender policy. Hindsight is always regarded as 20/20 vision. Reflecting on the struggles over the 40 or more years since the unfolding of innovations related to establishing WAND, mounting the WICP, establishing women's studies groups, and institutionalizing the Women in Development Studies program, reveal that without a forethought or intent, at each stage the innovators had to be strategically subversive. And the outstanding success at every stage resulted from bottom-up innovative actions on the part of women in the academy, rather than being imposed either from above or from without. Earlier, I alluded to the fact that at no stage was the process a walk in the park. Active resistance expressed as negativity and even hostility, described by Keith Hunt as carping criticism, was evident at every stage. In relation to the UWI AISS project of cooperation, there were complaints about women securing funding which would otherwise have been available to mainstream university programs, with suggestions that, as with Black studies in the programs of the 1960s in the US, which had subsequently been disbanded, the Women in Development Studies would suffer a similar fate. In spite of sustained skepticism, the IGDS now stands tall and poised to become the locus for producing, housing, and disseminating information on critical cultural, social, economic, and political priorities addressed through a prism which takes into account the impact of interlocking structures of inequality with gender at the very center of the interrogation. In so doing, it could become a well-needed Caribbean gender observatory and would no doubt be a sought-out center of excellence for data, publications, and research expertise within and beyond the region. The track record of the Institute attests to this, and such an achievement would give substance and form to the vision and dreams of the innovative pioneers who launched out in uncharted waters some 35 to 50 years ago. Thank you very much.
We pause to welcome Dr. Chang. I don't think he realizes that he's actually the next speaker, so I'm going to invite you up to the podium now.
Thank you, Ms. Bell, to the distinguished panelists. I'm not sure how I fit into this very distinguished group up here. To the university team, Professor MacDonald, and the members of the university administration. First, let me just express my appreciation to those at the university who invited me to participate in this commemorative forum for the UWI. I'm not sure exactly what role, but I figured I'm here because from a student point of view and the era of the 70s. So I'll try to look at that briefly, but I can say it's a very interesting period. Prof MacDonald was a couple of years ahead of me, but it was quite an interesting era. But by then, of course, UWI, Caribbean personalities and academics had established themselves in charge of the university. I mean, at that point, and UWI had in fact become a university of first choice for many of us, certainly from coming out of Montego Bay. And although in the growing year, there are still individuals looking at going overseas for university. And coming here was not a big challenge in terms of choosing to come to UWI, although I'm among the Jamaicans whose parents my mother had migrated to the UK, and I could get into university in England at almost no cost. And did at one time give serious thought of doing chemistry special at Manchester University. At the same time, I did the university scholarship exam and applied to the medical faculty and was fortunate to get a UWI Open Scholarship. I wrote in Jamaica at the time, but more critically, it didn't have the profile of Jamaica Scholarship. They awarded 12 scholarships every year for the Caribbean. But in fact, once you got into university, you realized it had more value than the Jamaica Scholarship because the 70s was the time of inflation. And the UWI scholarships kept pace with the fees. Jamaica government scholarship did not keep pace. It had chance even as a Jamaica scholarship. But so I came into university from Montego Bay, Cornell College, a little bit coming to Kingston as a country boy as well. But university was certainly, for us, still an impressive institution to come to. But the 70s was a time of change and transition in the country. 10 years post-independence, and nationally there was a lot of discourse and the way forward for the country, the kind of country we want to have, and the whole debate on socialism versus capitalism versus a Caribbean personality. And that I will speak to some more because at that time there were distinct academics who spoke not only of the traditional North-South socialist capitalists, but there was a distinct Caribbean kind of ideology emerging, which has not continued, but people like William Demas and people who wrote about the Caribbean man was emerging. And we came to university, of course, with an open mind. I've got into medicine, which was the kind of still an elitist kind of side of the university. But the students of then really had their own questions about what society was like and what we should do, and were willing to participate and challenge a lot of issues. And I thought I'd focus my presentation on some of the issues that we took up and challenged, and I think maybe some of them we have left too far behind. In fact, the first impression beside coming to an impressive campus, and I got my space in Taylor Hall. And I did say we view Taylor Hall as the Hall of Halls. I don't want to say, but there's also some rationale. You know, Irving Hall had many of our Caribbean brothers and sisters. Chancellor Hall was all male, and Seco was for the nice girls. Taylor Hall was the Jamaican hall where men and women went to, right? And we saw that in that way. But one of the first activity we faced, I would have recalled, was we challenged pretty much everything that was happening on the campus, although we had well-established Caribbean leadership. And in my very first year, we had the incident of what we call the burn gowning, because we questioned the dress code of the university and wondered why you should have a red gown as your graduating gown. It did not represent the Caribbean as far as we were concerned. And we think that having moved to the level we were in terms of Caribbean academic and leadership, the university entire ecosystem should be more reflective of a Caribbean personality. And we started with that, where I think it was near to, for that year before graduation. I had not been there when Princess Margaret came, but we decided that the color of the gown should be changed and should have a pattern that is more reflective of the Caribbean, and there were proposals for bandana, for other things reflecting the Caribbean colors. And we made sure that year a group of us took a batch of gowns right behind this hall and burnt them before graduation. Because, and I started with that because it represented a time when students were still willing to challenge much of the norms in not only the society, but on the campus. And there are a number of personalities on campus, of course, which we could go to show what was happening. But I started not very occasionally with the gun burning incident, which laid the foundation for much of what happened on the campus over the next 5 years. So it was a time of great interest, and I'll have to maybe go from student to academic, because if you looked as a student activist, I got caught up in quite a number of issues which is beyond medicine, and therefore I won't focus much on medicine, which has a well-established history. And I think Professor McDonald would be a much better person to talk about the evolution of the medical faculty and the academic era, as other speakers have tried to do. What I look at was the atmosphere university. And although we were challenging a number of the values, and I will speak to how some things did change, but I recall at that time in the faculty, of course, we had a number of academics who were also raising issues in a different way. So the names of people like G. Beckford and Norman Gervan, younger Trevor Monroe, and later on Carlson, were people who populated the social science department. And in many ways, social scientists were seen as the politicians, and we had many political debates on campus, which ranged from extreme left to conservative medium, but largely leftist. But what was of interest, I said, there was quite a body of individuals who were looking at what was Caribbean rather than just what was either Marxist or Leninist or capitalist. And I think that thread of thought, unfortunately, has not carried on in my view, and it's something that I think may be worthwhile looking back again, because much work was done by these individuals. While many were seen as just left-wing socialists, there was a lot of discussion surrounding what could be done in the Caribbean. And if you might say, I referred to one before, but all the names I have called were seen in society as individual, outstanding individuals in the university. Today, I don't find you have too many names emerging as individuals who are giving lead to social thought. And that is something I think that has become lacking in our university, because we have become, certainly, some might say that we are maturing and we are more focused on hard research and developing in both science and social sciences. But I think the issue of how society evolves, who we are and where we are going, is still a very relevant question for a university, and especially University of West Indies, which is still the leading academic institution in the Caribbean and one of the leading academic institutions in this part of the world. In that era, those questions really did quite a bit of excitement, and students were involved, were getting more involved. In fact, it was during my era that we got students to sit on most of the university committees, prior to that, you were students, and while you were questioning issues, you were not involved in the university governance to that extent. I think by the time I was elected guild president, we sat on all the university committees except the University Grants Council. And I think I was the second or third guild president to so occupy those high offices. But in the campus itself, there was a lot of changes happening because we had gone through a number of years from a governance point of view. It was during that time we had the appointment of A.Z. Preston as our principal, I think then Pro Vice-Chancellor, who came from the financial background rather than the academic background. He was well known as an advisor on financing at university, and that reflected to the emerging challenges to financing at university, which I'll speak to a little later on, but I mention it because, again, the University Guild then became very keen on how the university governance structure should operate and why we should be in committees. And it was also at that point we got appointed, and I suspect because he was in finance, an academic as a pro-chancellor for academic affairs. That was an interesting activity because the students had a say, I had a say in it, and we got Prof Layla appointed. There was certainly big debate as to whether Prof Layla should be or whether Prof Oshane, who was the professor of history and well known at the time, should be, and the students' vote went in favor of Prof Layla because I suspect, besides being myself a scientist, the science students in numbers dominated while the political students pretty much led the debates in other areas. But it's also true that we did not, the arts faculty always had a low profile at that time. The medical people were very, as I said, kind of still in that almost elitist mode. The social scientists were very active and almost aggressive in challenging issues, and those of us from the sciences who aligned with them would have much debate on how to move forward, and the natural sciences were the biggest block. So our students, unfortunately, had a low profile. I said we viewed, some of the scientists viewed the art faculty here where we just had some wonderful, nice ladies to talk, to share company with. But Prof Layla was appointed the first, I think it would be the vice principal, but then it was pro-chancellor for student affairs. And indeed, students continued to, we had many debate and issues affecting the whole governance structure of the University of the West Indies. And it was a great time for involvement. I think the Guild then, the position we appointed, maybe the first really active, and it is the students' affairs that did that, appointed the university sports coordinator. I think the first was Fred Green, who did quite an interesting job over time. And we continued to seek to be involved in pretty much everything. But of course, one of the challenges I faced at the time is that the Guild had run some serious debts. And we had to go about finding ways to recover our costs. And for the students who are here, we took on the challenge not only to pay our bills, pay our debts, and continue student activity. And a number of the things we did, which I not being done now really as that much. There was still a very large contingent of Caribbean students, and it was the university students and the Guild that ran charters to the Eastern Caribbean. One of the big way we made, although the fares were cheaper, we made good money, sending back home the Barbadians, Antiguans, and Trinidad and down every year. I'm not sure when they stopped, but there was a large enough student body that the Guild actually made good money sending back the students down. At good rates. We chartered planes from Baugh, so they left late at night and we got a good deal from them. We, in fact, got involved in bringing in what would be traditional university shirts. Despite of our protest against the red gown, we organized and brought in I think it's the last I've seen, I think I see some now. We brought in a whole batch of university paraphernalia, t-shirts, vests, windbreakers, and a whole series with University Pelican on it, but we brought them in different colors, and we thought those were in keeping with our thinking, although could have been a little more Caribbean. We had to import them, and we made a business of it and imported for University of Technology and Michael and made some good money and paid our debts. So the students, while challenging a lot of issues, still sought to establish a record of good governance in the guild. In fact, we reclaimed the university students' union. And that in itself, although that following cohesive trend is a story that the students and our members of the university should recall. When I came to campus, students' union was a no-no for students. You just couldn't go down there. It was taken over by elements from downtown, large Wildman Street, and individuals from Augustone. And what was interesting in that time is that they were brought on campus by the radicals. And I think that's perfectly clear. Not so radical then, and they would have dances down there, and of course we couldn't go down there. But all my friends, including my friends on the left, or those from the center, we had a discussion that we must reclaim the students' union because nobody would go down. Medical faculty, social scientists, the entire student body that was re-elected, and indicated that in going forward, the students must not only establish good quality governance, which we led, and we did pretty well at that, but we must reclaim the union. And the very first month I was elected guild president, which sometime after, just near Easter, the students' union rented to a group of young men from Wildman Street. And we decided collectively that we should cancel that booking. Of course, the person in charge of the students' union would be the students' union president, external at the time, a gentleman named John Simpson, a good friend. Well, I think he migrated. But as president of the guild, I come from Cornell College as a head boy, active in Student Sixth Form Association. I got elected president, but most of my guild colleagues were left of my philosophy, and they were close to the radical, to the student, those who had taken over the guild. We decided, fine, you must cancel this booking. And I said, yes, let's do it, and begin activities to attract our students. They had made a down payment, and the first thing when I said, all right, students' union president, well, call the gentlemen, we have a meeting, and they were actually, those who had booked the place were waiting outside of the Taylor Hall, it's the recreation room at the front, and they were waiting outside there to hear what the decision was. So we made a decision, I said to the students' union president, return the funds, here it is, and instruct them that we are no longer leasing out the University Students' Union because it was being held exclusive for student activity. The entire guild sat back in the chair and looked at me and said, Horace Chang, you're the president, you must deliver the money. I guess it might have been a good thing I was from Montego Bay. Montego Bay is not quite like what it was today. Might have been different if it was today. But in a sense, it was some type of value. So I walked outside, and I must confess, I met 3 young men that I said, looking in their face, had I known them, I would not have gone out there. I figured everybody else knew them. I said, if it was today coming from Montego Bay, I'd have had a different impression and maybe had a different position. But there were some of the hardest young faces I could have seen in my entire life. I was still new in university. But they accepted it, and they went away. And the first session we had at the student union after that, we actually employed police and security guard with dogs. So we were going, and it was well accepted by the students then, but we started a process that reclaimed activity, the students' union. We had a serious activity, a lot of entertainment activity. We brought on, then there was the family of musicians, the Rankins, who were in jazz heavily and regularly in the afternoons, and we continued to do things to transform the union and restore it to the students. I'm told my time is up, right? We're going so fast. But refer to those incidents again, we went on from there into looking at how the university operated, and it was a constant series of activity and discourse as to how we should operate and what we should do on campus. The changes continued. The last thing I'd like to refer to before getting on how we got involved is as student leadership and politics every day. There are 2 other incidents I do brief reference to. One was they changed the country, which was not just political, but the economy was changing as well. And we learned our lesson even when we were not in economics and inflation. There was a big debate on the price of food at the 4 halls. And we challenged the campus, and we spent 2 weeks auditing the campus and negotiating to maintain food price. And I must very quickly say to the students here, I guess I learned my politics there very well. But I recall spending 16 hours arguing over 5 cents. We settled the price of all the bills from 9 in the morning till 12 midday. And we argued from 12 midday and 12 midnight to settle the price of rice, because we decided that the starch should remain the same price, because every student should be able to afford 1 protein, 1 starch at least in the day. And we argued for 16 hours over the price of rice. We won the argument and actually lost the battle, because not only did inflation take us the next year, but the administrators of the hall decided that rice was always served in limited quantities on a daily basis, and served pumpkin rice instead, on which there was no price control. And we had to pay the higher price. Second was, of course, in those days of questioning what was happening on campus, and we were raising continued debates, we had another incident in which the army was mobilized. I wasn't here in the Rodney years, it was mobilized to surround the campus, because we were debating the same issue of what was happening in food price. And students were restricted. I remember meeting Colonel Lloyd at the gate of the campus with a V-150 armored car. And that was, I think, at the time we were having another change on the issue of student administration, as well as an other incident was when the university workers formed their own union, UAW. So I mentioned these instead because it was a continuous series of activity while you're doing academic and learning. There was a lot of challenges, a lot of changes happening, which has led to what we have today. Some of them have reverted to what used to be, I think, and so you can see the legacy of our student government, etc., as well as significant changes have come about during that time. And for me, it was a most intriguing and interesting period, a very political period. In fact, I do think maybe we should have a little bit more of that kind of political debate on campus, because the country certainly hasn't settled totally on the character of its government, the character of how we should move in terms of public governance. And I think the university ought to be playing a wider and more intense role on how we should govern ourselves. Let me thank you all, and any questions after this?
He can't help himself, he's a politician. Thank you, Dr. Chang. Our Guild President, as I said, was unavoidably absent, but our just outgoing Guild President, Ms. Michaela Gonzalez, maybe the 3rd female Guild President we have had. She's going to spend a few minutes, not like Dr. Chang. I know Michaela is good. Michaela has responded at the last minute. So we're very thankful. Michaela, you have to go, you could go right around this side, and she'll just speak a little bit about her own experience as Guild President. She didn't try to burn any gowns, I can tell you that. She didn't do anything like that at all. So let's hear from Michaela.
Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Dr. Camille Bell-Hutchinson, other members of the platform, guests, members of the Towers Courtesy Society, everyone, good evening. So as Dr. Bell-Hutchinson rightfully said, I am the immediate past Guild President, and Dr. Chang, I know he was a bit lengthy, but that's because the experience being not only Guild President, but just merely serving, in student leadership at this level, it carries an abundance of experiences, and it's very hard for you to fit it in simply, 20 to 15 minutes, right? So I will start by just briefly saying why I decided to even run for Guild. I am from the Faculty of Science and Technology. I studied actuarial science, and being in my little shell at first, you'd expect someone who does math, or it's the stereotypical thing to say, you should just be in the books. But as the poster rightfully says, or the banner, at the Mona Campus, we inspire excellence and produce leaders. And apart from my academic knowledge gain as well, being in the classroom, I was constantly challenged to solve problems. And apart from being the mathematician, I saw other problems around me on campus. And as I said, being here, you're cultivated to have a mind that says, okay, how can I solve out of classroom problems? And so I decided to run for Guild. At first, I decided to run for the position of External Affairs Chairperson. And that's the person in charge of outreach, because that's really my passion. And then I realized, okay, yeah, so many times students, we say, we want the rice to be 5 cents less. We want hall fees, as always, to be less. We want school fee to be less. I can see Dr. Bell and Professor are so happy, they're like, at least we don't have to argue about it now like last year. So I can say this now with a lighter heart, And you have all these things that you want to change, and you say to yourself, so many students have the solutions, but then they don't say it to anyone. And then you have the few students who are brave enough to come on a platform and say, okay, since you can't use your voice, tell me what you want to be done, and I'll be the voice for the voiceless. And student leadership at this level and at any level, even our political leaders at the national level, that's what they do, right? So you see problems to be solved, and you not only be the voice, but the executor of the solutions. For last year, being Guild President, the 3 things that stood out the most about what our council had to encounter was, one, we don't want to say demolition, but the renovation of the Irving Hall. And that was a touchy one, because whether it was 70 years ago or last year, when persons love something, they just love something. And I know Professor McDonald was trying to bring the vision to us about why it is that we need to be doing certain renovations and all of that, but there are a lot of persons who, I'm pretty sure if Dr. Chang right now, if it was back in his time and they asked to hit down Taylor Hall, Chancellor Hall, any of the traditional halls, it would have been a no. 70 years later, it is still a no. Right? Mind you, we're still discussing, and we're now in a day and age where whether it is because of technology or just better negotiation and bargaining skills, we're able to have discussions and come to the table. So we don't necessarily have to, like stories I have heard about bursars being locked up in rooms and such. That did not happen in our year. But I've heard very drastic stories like that. So I mean, even though advocacy is still the order of the day today, we have different means of doing that. The second most memorable thing to me would have been when our finalizing students, over 2,000 of them, decided to wait until last minute to realize that some of them had 1 million, 2 million owing, and they would not be able to do their final exams. And boy, this was a time where I looked to my counselors and we were like, what are we going to do? Because it's not like it's just some miscellaneous fees or something. You're talking about 2 million and 1 million, and majority of the students owe that much. And that's not money you find overnight. So it's not like you can just say, okay, and so, mind you, I will say now, being on the outside, you do stop and say, what makes a student not be responsible? And it's not that students don't want to be responsible, it's just that the climate and the economy that we're in right now, sometimes it's just really hard. And you want to be a doctor, you're not sure how, but you tell yourself, what, this is what I want to do, and you tell yourself, I'll figure it out as I go along. And sometimes it just catches up on you, but you don't want to let go of your dreams. And I remember going to Professor Beckles. Mind you, I also heard of stories back in his day on the Guild. And I said to myself, he's always talking about our generation not having a movement, and we know we need some revolutionary kind of atmosphere. So I said, well, I said, Professor Beckles, I'm coming to you not as Vice-Chancellor, but as a past student leader. Mind you, I don't know how he made that difference, but trust me, he gladly switched over into that mode. And I said, well, and I explained to him everything that was happening. And he says, Michaela, call on the government. And as simple as it sounds, I was like, call on the government? And he's like, yes, that's what they're there for. And at the same time, you're at the helm of student leadership, where at the premier university of the Caribbean, you should be able to go to them, tell them what the problem is, and ask. And mind you, he gave me some words of wisdom and encouragement. And that evening, I went on national television, was speaking about it, and at the end of it, did exactly that. Mind you, I said at the end of the day, if anybody had asked, I would be like, Professor Beckles told me to do it. But it turned out well, He didn't know now, but it turned out well, and by the next day, the Prime Minister would have responded. I mean, yes, there were hiccups along the way, but it was just to show you that I think back then, something that we're lacking right now is that the generation before us, they're a little more assertive in terms of when it comes on to student leadership. And even maybe addressing some of the problems of our country. And I don't know if it's that everybody has just, maybe we get things too easily now. So overall, we're a bit more passive, what it is towards our schoolwork. Because even in classes, back then, I used to hear about the tests being even harder than they are now. But students used to take research and getting into the schoolwork, as in it wasn't just about passing tests. It was about coming and really gaining knowledge and giving back knowledge. And so I know everything has changed about that. But that experience also stood out to me. And lastly, it's not so much an actual experience. And I know, Dr. Bell, I'm about to wrap up. It's not so much a physical experience, but for me, when I began my journey as guild president, we were deciding on a vision statement. Because I believe you're going to lead people, they have to know where they're being led to. And so we said, what is the campus lacking? And we decided to come up with the vision statement, restoring trust and renewing inspiration for change. And for me, that meant not disregarding what happened before us. So from the leaders before us who did things right, acknowledging what they did right and say, okay, we can take from that. Also putting our own twist on it. So many times we say nothing can happen because nothing will change. So we wanted to restore trust in the student body. And as we said, renew inspiration for change. So we wanted new persons who never thought about being leaders to come forth. And right after my presidency, I actually had, so there was somebody who ran against me, so there were 2 candidates in my year, and the year following there were 6 presidential candidates. And I think that in itself and all the other posts also had more candidates than before. So I think it's the right time for us to, coincidentally, to be celebrating our 70th anniversary, but I think it also marks the fact that we're moving in the right direction and we will continue to inspire excellence and produce leaders. Thank you.
Well, I thought that was good for somebody who hadn't got a chance to prepare at all. So thank you, Michaela. Professor Hall, it's your turn.
Distinguished members of the panel, distinguished colleagues, friends, one of the disadvantages of being on this podium is that you hear nothing that the speaker says. And so if you see us looking, we don't know what the speakers were saying. So, Principal, I think you have a challenge to make this place more acoustically acceptable. This would be great. Ladies and gentlemen, I was asked to share with you my experience as principal during the 1990s. Unlike the previous speakers, I had no constituency, so to speak. I did not have a faculty perspective, although I was a faculty member in this campus for a year. I had no student perspective because I had been a student I was in the 2nd class of the University of the West Indies. And so when I graduated, that was quite some time. Worse, I had lived out of Jamaica for 30 years after graduation. And so when I returned to Jamaica, the first designation I had was as a foreigner. That they had appointed a foreign person to be principal of the Mona Campus. And so, can you imagine, that's where I started. The second point, and I noticed people spoke about the revolution and so, when I came in the 1990s, the revolution was over. The worse, they hadn't got rid of the revolutionaries. So the revolutionaries were here, but there was no revolution. Although I must confess that I found that very, very helpful. Indeed, one of the reasons why the campus is today what it is because of those revolutionaries turned constructive people in the system. And there are examples. I mean, after all, the head of the union when I came became deputy principal. The other became dean of, the chief negotiator is now the chief human resource person on the campus. So, you know, the revolution has ended, and so people are beginning to come. But let me suggest that the perspective of the principal was very different from those of the constituent members of the community. Because my concern was, how will the institution survive in a time of rapid changes? Worse, while I was an administrator before, and I had worked in university, the largest university, public university in North America, it's the State University of New York, and that university was involved in the development of the state, in the development of, so you had a very different awareness of the value of the university and what it can do than what I found here. Nonetheless, as a black nationalist, as a Jamaican nationalist, and as an unrepentant regionalist, despite my rather unwelcome first few months, I stayed. Because when I was a faculty member, I came and I looked around for a few months, and the place was so unwelcoming that I left. But this time I decided, look, you have to stay. This university is far too valuable and far too important in the lives of the future of the Caribbean, and you have an opportunity now, so I stayed. And having decided to stay, my challenge was, what do you do with this university? It had a distinguished record of scholarship, service, teaching, as Professor Baugh. But frankly, in the 1990s, all the questioning that had been around in the 70s, Dr. Chan, people were now saying the faculty was demoralized. Students were no longer asking those fundamental questions that you raised. And so the challenge was, how do we make this university a reliable partner in development? Fortunately, because I was viewed as a foreigner, and really with some great hostility at first, I decided, well, I would lay out a program, and thanks to Dr. Longsworth, she took me to lunch and at her Chinese restaurant in Sovereign, what is it called? When I came, because she was supposed to be the executive assistant to the principal. And she welcomed me and said, well, I am going to be with you, and let us plan this future. 2 weeks later, she left. So here was I, and when I said I was unwelcome, I mean, I don't want to go into all the details, but a couple of examples would suffice. I used to have prayer meetings in the office in the mornings, praying for deliverance of the staff from the principal. I kid you not. I walked in, and there was a prayer meeting by the staff. The one, though, that I found was interesting. A colleague whom I trusted. I said, well, if nobody else were around, I can, and he invited me to lunch. And I thought, wow, I am now into the business. When we went to lunch, he picked up another colleague, and he said, make no mistake about it. This is not a friendly lunch. It is to tell you, because we know you, that all your ideas of change, please drop them now. We are here to defend the status quo. So before you begin, I thought it was useful to warn you. And I'm serious, you know. So I said, well, that being the case, since I have no friends, I now have a free hand to do what I wanted. And I proceeded. I gave us my inaugural speech. I laid out a program of change, you know, access to university. But I knew nobody would read it. And that was it turned out to be good, because they ignored all the changes that I had projected, and so I could implement them and nobody would know. And indeed, they didn't know until 2000, after my first 5 years, I prepared the achievements of the campus and put it out in a book, 1996 to 2000. So those of you who wanted to find out what happened, it's available in writing. But nobody knew what we were doing. But how then did we make changes? And today, I must say, the campus, thanks to 20 years of change, is a better place and better positioned to take up the challenges around it, internally and externally. Because in the last 20 years, it was a period of what I call capacity building. It was a period of community building. It was a period of research that impacted not only internally but externally. And so I find the campus today a much more, quote-unquote, progressive place. Of course, the principal might not feel that way when students arrive at his door. But there were three things, at least three things that I felt very strongly about. One was that this campus, that we are here for the students. And therefore, we have to have a student-centered, not a student-friendly, because you can be friendly without being centered, a student-centered campus, which meant reducing what I call the abuse of faculty over students. You know, they didn't think so, but what it meant is that we had to put the student at the center. And a whole raft of changes were taken. New building, new residences, a bus service to take students off campus. In fact, last week, Saturday, I was rather pleased. I was at the, what is it called? Devon House. And this bus pulled up. It's University of the West Indies, a group of students. Well, I thought they were students anyway. Came off the bus and went to have ice cream at the ice cream. And I said, wow, this is, the change continues. That you could now find reliable transportation for the students to go off campus and return. That is the kind of thing I meant by student-centered. The second, another component of this was that the university should become a really modern institution and should take account of the technological changes occurring in the world at large and impacting on us. And so we set out on the program of using technology in all our business, in the classrooms, in research, in services, and so on. But even there, I found it, I must tell you, I found an interesting, my first meeting with the unions, and I'll come back to that, but I met with them, and they said, look here, we are going to strike. I had been here for 1 week, and I was told I should lead the negotiations. My first meeting, the fellow said, you have nothing to tell us. We don't want to meet with you. And they proceeded to have a conference under the undercroft. The other union was about to strike, And I said, well, suppose you have all these strikes. Apparently strike was a normal thing at the university before the 1990s. So one of the ways of getting it, what I told you, we got clearly, there's no more than 14%. Let us start there. But you might be able to persuade the government to give you $1 million to buy instructional equipment, what we then call the technology grants, for 3 years, so that every faculty member could get a computer and use it in classrooms. We then proceeded to put communication and technology in the classrooms and so on. And then, of course, faculty had not changed any. You couldn't put the faculty with the students to learn about the use of computer in technology, in teaching. So we got a lab and so now you find that in administration, in everything, there is a clear sense that the use of technology is preeminent. Finally, let me, since I have 10 minutes, how many? Good. The last one I'll touch on then is Research Day. Research, generally. To my way of thinking, research defined a university. The quality of your research has determined your reputation, and that's what you're in the business for. Yes, you taught, and so on. So I felt that it was important to place research at the center of the 3 activities. Hence, Research Day, and I was very fortunate this morning. I got the first Research Day folder and the letter that I wrote to faculty inviting them to the first Research Day. It was done, incidentally, by Vice-Chancellor for the 50th anniversary. It was one of the activities for the 50th anniversary. So today, celebrating the 70th with a Research Days, is very significant. It's 20 years of this activity. But you can see the difference between Research Days and a Research Day. The time we had for Research Day then was 9:30 to 7. That was it. Research Day was one day, more or less, but it had some of the same purposes. Now, the key to it is if you walk through the exhibition hall, and I would invite you to do so, you will be left with no questions, in my view, that this university is now ready to take its role as research, not only discovery of new knowledge, dissemination of that information, and most important, the application of that to generate innovations in the life of the people of this region. And I want to commend those who have said that. In all of this, of course, as I'm sure, Principal, I'm always referring to you now, but I'm sure you would understand that when I came to the campus, I was told before I came that it had a financial problem, you know. But it would be solved before I came. When I turned up, there was a budget, there was a deficit of $1 billion. So for the first few months, I couldn't send anybody to university meetings. Worse, in the principal's office, there was not even a desk, not a pen. I had to go to my brother and he gave me a pen, desk set, nothing. And when I asked, can't you purchase it? He said, no. The principal budget had been reallocated elsewhere. So I learned very quickly that you had to live within your means and to generate funds. So two of the elements of the change in that period was that I told people, they didn't accept it very easily, but that you had to live, there would be no deficit spending. And I said, that means that you spend only what you receive, not what is owed to you, what you receive. The second was, we have to find additional resources, and hence the Business Development Office and a number of income generating, the Mona Visitors Lodge and so on. So what I'm suggesting then was that by the end of the 90s, this campus had already moved in a strategic direction and transformed itself into becoming a really contributor to the economic and social development of this region. And I think that, I would suggest, was the legacy of the 1990s to today. Thank you so much.
Principal MacDonald and Principal Longsworth, Deputy Principal Colwell, Lady R, Principal Elsa Leorini and PVC Hamilton, and all colleagues and friends and students and distinguished panelists. We have had a very rich exchange of experiences. My task is to maybe speak in 3 phases within the 20 minutes, partly biographical, my own journey here, and to say something about the evolution of the Mona Campus and the campus within the context of Jamaica and the Caribbean. I arrived at Mona in 1979 with a grip. I was straight out of graduate school. I had just finished a PhD, and this was my first job. I was given a contract on arrival. I was told while in Birmingham, England, where I was living, I don't need to see the contract until I come to Mona. And Registrar Robertson assured me that it would be a contract I would find quite amenable. I arrived and read the contract and discovered it was the lowest contract ever issued on the history of the Mona campus. I was offered a job as temporary assistant, part-time, temporary assistant, part-time evening lecturer. We don't do those contracts anymore. There were no benefits. But I was so happy to be in Jamaica, I signed a contract. I was 24 years old, And 2 weeks later, I went into what is now the Neville Hall Lecture Theatre to give my first lecture. And I introduced myself to the students. I said, "Good evening. I am Dr. Beckles, and it's my pleasure to take you through this program." There were 2 students in the front row. I detected from their accents, one was Jamaican and one was Trinidadian. And one of them said, "Hey boy, where you from?" And I said, "I'm from Barbados." And he said, the Trinidad student said, why all you Bajans love give so much trouble?" And the 2 of them came up on the podium, lifted me by the arms, and threw me out of the lecture theatre. I went to the dean and asked him if he could please come, the late great Neville Hall, if he could please come and introduce me to these students. And he came and he said, "Students, this is Dr. Beckles." Now, they thought I was a student. They thought I was a student fooling around because I was wearing my jeans, my t-shirt, and my Jesus slippers. Those young people were so embarrassed, and they spent the rest of the semester apologizing to me. But it was a great beginning because it began with humor. I spent 6 years on the Mona Campus in the history department, and I would argue today that those were the 6 most enjoyable years of my life. When I had my oral exam a few weeks before I arrived, the great Jamaican scholar Stuart Hall was my external examiner. And at the end of the examination, he said, "Congratulations, I understand you are going out to Mona." I said, "Yes, I'm going to Mona." He said, "I have one piece of advice for you. If you wish to have an academic career, there is a place on the Mona campus called the SCR. You must avoid it. And especially, there is a gentleman called Herman Mackenzie who you must avoid." And lo and behold, the very day I arrived at Mona, I went to the SCR, and the first person I met was Herman Mackenzie, who became my very good friend, and I spent 6 years visiting the SCR almost every night. And I did this because I was living in Taylor Hall Flats, so that makes me a Taylorite. And I would walk down to the SCR at the end of a day and have a beer, and there I met most of the great Mona scholars, administrators, and activists. I cannot imagine what it would have been like had I not come to Mona. I had a choice of taking up a position at Manchester University or the University of Nairobi. I was offered 3 positions, and I could not decide which one to sign. I knew I wanted to go to Africa. I knew I wanted to go to Jamaica. but my family was living in England, and I was expected to stay in England. I flipped a coin, and I said, heads I go home to the Caribbean, tails I go to Africa. And it came on heads, and I jumped on the plane and came to Mona. As I said, I came on a one-year contract. 9 months, in fact, in those days. At the end of it, I marked my scripts. In May, I packed up my grip, and I went back to England. And I said goodbye to everyone. The history department had a great party for me. We had a wonderful party at Neville Hall's home, and off I went back to the UK from whence I came. Then I got a phone call from the Vice-Chancellor saying to me that in light of the passing of Professor Elsa Gavaya, that the department would wish me to return to fill her position. And so I turned around and came back to Jamaica. I entered what was then an all-star cast department. The history department was a powerhouse of intellectualism. It was one of the centers of gravity of the Mona Campus. There was Douglas Hall, extraordinary scholar, Elsa Gavaya, Roy O.J., Patrick Bryan, Carl Campbell. Ken Hall had gone back from history back to the US. Barry Higman and Kamau Brathwaite. It was a powerful department, and I was the rookie in it. I was the child in this department of extremely brilliant and highly productive scholars and researchers. And I would sit there and say to myself, when I grow up, I would like to be one of these people. It was extraordinary mentoring. And I remember my first departmental meeting, I was sitting in the only soft chair in the department's office. They were all metal chairs in those days, some very hard metal chairs. And there was one soft chair, and I sat on it because I got there first. And in came Elsa Gavaya, and I got up and I said, "Professor, please." And she looked at me and she said, "Young man, sit down. I do not support discrimination for women." And I sat down. But I knew that I had a responsibility because Mona was pulsating with intellectual activity. It was a vibrant intellectual space, arguably one of the finest in the world. I was surrounded by people like Eddie Baugh, who moved like silk. Quiet, brilliant, precise. And he mentored most of us who were youngsters in those days. I used to sit in faculty boards and admire his balance and his poise. But I learned the administration of the department and of the faculty and of the campus in those days because I had a very keen interest in the relationship between academia and administration. And in my graduate years, my academic supervisor was Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and he would always say, if academics don't run the place, someone will come and run it for you. And would always insist that we should pay attention to the environment we are called to manage. But Mona was a Caribbean space. The Caribbean identity of Mona was built into its very foundation years, when, as a medical faculty, some very brilliant young people from all over the Caribbean assembled here to set up the Mona Campus. And our first Vice-Chancellor, Sir Arthur, developed a Caribbean perspective on what the university ought to be, and he was the architect of the Tri-Campus University, that UWI should move after 20 years or so beyond Mona into the region, and he conceptualized and implemented the Tri-Campus model of UWI, with Mona at its core, with Mona at its center. And so when I came here to Mona in '79, it was clear to me and to everyone that Mona was the heart of the University of the West Indies. And it had received a tremendous investment of prestige and honor from the government and people of Jamaica, who welcomed it, endowed it with respect. I felt at a very early stage, I felt that had the UWI campus been located at the beginning in a different island, I am not sure it would have survived. I'm not sure. Knowing what I know about the issues of class and race and the other islands at that time, but I believe that the Jamaican people surrounded it, invested it with prestige and dignity, and I arrived and found a campus that was very respected. This is important, I believe. This is very, very important. I arrived at Mona 10 years after Rodney had departed. I needed to understand the significance of that, not only for Mona, but for the intellectual tradition of the Caribbean. I entered the department where Walter Rodney had left his mark. And I thought there and then that he represented the Mona campus coming to maturity, coming to terms with its identity. An elite university, a university for the elite, a university for the privileged few, coming to terms with the need to become an institution of the masses and of the people. And Walter Rodney represented that moment of transformation of the Mona campus, moving beyond its status as a small, privileged academic community, reaching out to the masses of people. And Walter was one of the brightest and finest of the Mona graduates. So here was a Mona graduate coming back to Mona to drag Mona screaming into its second dispensation, screaming into its new era of paying attention to issues such as social justice, racial equality, decolonization, and the rise of an indigenous Caribbean spirit. A university taking responsibility for the masses of people. And I believe that was a major transition in the Mona campus. I arrived thereafter. The New World Group had laid the foundation for that transition. The search at Mona for an indigenous intellectual culture of research and engagement. I tell you, Mona was truly one of the most dynamic university environments anywhere in the world. The structures were responding to the changing of consciousness, and Mona became globally legendary. I had no doubt that the reason I came to Mona was because though I had emigrated to England at the age of 13, in my undergraduate years in a British university, I was inducted into the intellectual culture of Mona. The majority of the literature I read was written by Caribbean writers. I admired them from a distance, so that I was really a product of Mona, even though I have never been to Mona. And I think this is an important point. My own research, my own PhD, was a response to G. Beck's book, Persistent Poverty. I had never met George Beckford, but my research theme was a response to his book, Persistent Poverty, which was a study of Jamaica. So I was schooled in the Mona school before I joined it physically. And when I arrived, I considered myself to be a Mona man. I know as Vice-Chancellor I have to choose my words carefully, but in terms of my ancestral upbringing, I was and remain a Mona man, because those were the literary and intellectual foundations on which I emerged, though at a distance. It could be, though, that Mona seemed the logical place because I did not wish to go back to Barbados. And there are reasons, sometimes in the back of your consciousness. I was named after a great uncle, Hilary Beckles, who was able to put together a boat fare back in the 40s to go to England, where he drove buses and eventually went to university and did classics. And Hilary Beckles returned to Barbados with his first-class honors in classics and could not get a job, because in those days only white people, or specifically only English people, were employed to teach classics in the grammar schools. And he emigrated from Barbados, went to Guyana, where he taught classics at Queen's College, where he taught Walter Rodney, Nigel Harris, my predecessor, C.Y. Thomas, all of those great Guyanese scholars. He taught them Latin and Greek. But he vowed that he will never return to Barbados. And he never did. So maybe that was in the back of my mind. Hilary Beckles II, knowing what could possibly happen had I returned. Then came the 80s, and the Mona Campus was reflecting upon the turbulence of the 60s and the 70s. The search for a Jamaican national transformation that was deep-seated and meaningful. In the 80s, we felt that the campus was consolidating itself against the background of the challenges of the 60s and 70s. It was an era of consolidation, and then came the 90s, the awful 90s. All of our economies crashed on the IMF. All were dependent on the IMF. Jamaica was in deep financial trouble, the budget cuts. We struggled to pay salaries at the Mona Campus. There was no funds for research. There was no funds for travel. It was a period where the academic community was deeply impoverished. There were no cars to be bought, and most of my colleagues then were driving old, beat-up VWs and ladders. It was a difficult time. It was a very difficult time. No one had a usable car. All drove VWs and ladders. It was difficult. And the spirit of Mona was sinking. Some scholars were in flight. Many had moved on, could not deal with the austerity. Real net income was falling rapidly, and our campus was threatened in terms of its very survival. There was a conversation about the nationalization of Mona, and that the government of Jamaica should nationalize and merge what was then cast with Mona to create the University of Jamaica. There was fear for the regional identity of the university. And I remember Carl Stone carrying out a poll on the campus. I was very close to Carl Stone. I used to work with him in his surveys in the communities. We would go down to the Gleaner and he would submit on a Friday night his polls on the Jamaica situation. And then we would go and drink a beer at one of the neighboring bars on Duke Street. And Carl Stone did a survey among the academics. Would you be prepared to work for a University of Jamaica? We were pleased that 75% of the Jamaican academics polled said they would not work for University of Jamaica. They would work for the University of the West Indies and no other. That was a significant moment, which I keep my files with all of these things because historians are great keepers of records. But the Mona campus began to retreat into itself as the blame game started. The university academics were held responsible for the decline of the Jamaican economy. They were accused of promoting social policies and political policies that could not work. They had lost sight of the need for economic growth. They had gone too far to the left in supporting social justice without a clear view about economic growth that was required. And the critique was persistent and deep-rooted. And of course, then we had Mr. Perkins, who labeled us all an academic ghetto. And we were all working for this academic ghetto, a place that was doing great harm to the people of Jamaica. But the campus survived through all of that because Mona, unlike the other campuses, had a tremendous sense of community. We did not find this on the other campuses as much. Mona had a community, largely, I think, because of the Mona Commons. The Mona Commons, which was a domestic space in which generations of children, academics raised their children. There was a community and there was an SCR. And between the College Commons and the SCR, Mona had a hardcore sense of itself. And that was the core that led to the resilience of Mona. It began to decline in student numbers at the turn of the century. And one could feel, by the turn of the century, one could feel that Mona was beginning to lose its prestige as the heartland of the university. St. Augustine was expanding at quite a rapid rate. And eventually, St. Augustine became larger than Mona. And that was a significant moment when the St. Augustine campus became our largest campus in terms of student numbers. Cave Hill was also expanding rapidly and had moved to 10,000 students, while Mona had shrunk to 13,000 students. It appeared that if Cave Hill had continued on that trajectory, that Cave Hill too would have surpassed Mona in terms of student numbers, the result of the economic crisis in Jamaica and the fact that the majority of students were having great difficulty in funding their education. In comparison with Barbados and Trinidad, where the government was paying 100% for their students. But then Mona went into its strategic planning, its visioning, and one felt that Mona again was building on its resilience, and Mona began to emerge with development, transformation, building on the legacy of Ken Hall, because Ken Hall had laid the foundation for the transformation and for the relationship with the corporate communities. Building on that, Professor Ezra Rainey, Gordon Shirley, and ultimately Principal MacDonald, Mona began to move. And I remember presenting a paper, even though I was principal of Cave Hill campus, and I made the statement that Mona is back. And one could feel it, that Mona had bounced back, and now we can say Mona is once again the largest campus in terms of student numbers. But we did not take comfort on the other campuses. We did not take comfort on the other campuses that Mona was going through these difficult diminishing years. We were always clear that the heartland of this university is the Mona campus. And as historians, we understood this very clearly, which is why when we had the conversation about building the regional headquarters, when those conversations were taking place, St. Augustine was the largest campus. And someone could have said, build the regional headquarters on the largest campus. We all agreed unanimously that the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies must be Mona, because this is where we started, this is where we developed, and Mona was the campus that ultimately spawned the other campuses. Come out, Professor, or my distinguished Professor Eddie Baugh knows of this because he started at Cave Hill. I remember arriving at Cave Hill and hearing about the legacy of Eddie Baugh in the English department. Woodville Marshall, who was at Mona, went to Cave Hill to set up Cave Hill, as did Keith Hunt. And of course, Keith Lawrence and the others went to St. Augustine to set up departments there. But Mona was the place that sent out the academics to build the other campuses. That was the legacy and the history. And so, Mona is back. There is no doubt about it. We are all proud of the fact that it is the hub of our university. It was here that we were placed on the global stage as a highly respected research academy. It was here that the spirit of UWI was built and established. It was here that the identity of UWI as an aggressive, determined institution committed to building Caribbeanness, determined to build a regional program. This was here that we started. And I can tell you, I feel proud to have been a part of it, because I arrived at Mona in the mid-period of the 70 years. So If we are celebrating 70 years, I arrived at Mona exactly in the middle of those 70 years and had the privilege and pleasure of meeting and learning from and speaking with those who have built the first 35 years and working with those who have now built these 30 years. I can tell you that I remember when the first fax machine was bought on the Mona Campus. I'm not sure, Dr. Longsworth, you were around in those days. You were working, you were in the principal's office. And I remember the principal called us. The principal called us and said to us, there is a piece of mysterious machinery that has just arrived in Mona. And Mona was the first campus in UWI to have a fax machine. I think it was 1982, 83, I can't remember. 83? 1983. And we all rushed over to the principal's office to see this thing, and we didn't believe it. And Principal Bunny Layla said, this thing works. You can send a message from A to B, and it would actually arrive. And we stood around this machine in absolute awe that this thing could work, that you could send a message through the air and it would arrive. It was a wonderful moment, and we said, yes, Mona has arrived. It has the first fax machine in the Caribbean. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this opportunity to reflect. Thank you.
Wow, what an evening this has been. I feel in a way that I've been in a time capsule, looking back in so many years, and I think the story, believe it or not, that might resonate is a fax machine. Now we're talking about Skype and Zoom, and who knows about Zoom? Zoom is a new way of meeting online. So it's a program that we can use. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been such an evening. Our intent when we first conceived this would be at this time, we would have asked for open discussion, but it is 7:56. And I don't think you would want me to ask you to have open discussion. But we do want to thank our panelists. Can we hear it for all our panelists? We want to thank them for the time they have taken to really sit and take us through a little piece of our history, the interesting moments of the struggles of the women with gender. Professor Hall coming in and being not accepted and being told that's not going to work. The changes are not going to work. Dr. Chang, he wasn't here when I told you he was my guild president. You were my guild president, you know. Professor Baugh in his own style. Michaela, thank you so much for coming. There is a vote of thanks to be had. I don't know where Professor Elimar Shearer has. She's behind me. So she's going to come and give the vote of thanks, and she will close this for us. So thank you all for coming. I'll tell you my thanks now and hand you over to Professor Shearer.
Thank you so much, Registrar, for taking us through this program. She's been chairing everything since this morning, so she's earned her ability to go home now as we wrap up. But we expect her back here tomorrow morning. The Registrar has thanked the panelists, and all that there is for me to do is to endorse that. But I also want to reassure Registrar Mitz, and I thank them, is with us. We not only have taped, but we are streaming to the diaspora. Yes, we are streaming, but we do have the tapes. This was one of the activities that we were told we had to tape. We have taped it, and as has been said, it's been a wonderful, I don't even know what to call it, smorgasbord of information, and it's just awesome as we reflect on our journey. Some of us have been here throughout a long part of that journey. Principal and I came to this campus early 70s as students, so we've been here a long time. You came a little before, Dr. Chang. The medical faculty does celebrate 70 years, so for us in the room that are from that faculty, this is also a really awesome moment, as we walk down memory lane, Professor Hicklin. So let me thank everybody. I want to thank the registrar. When we started to conceptualize this, we actually started conceptualizing this back in August. So what this has told us is that we need a couple more of these. Registrar, I'm done. Research Day finishes on Friday. You need a couple more of these throughout UA 70. But most importantly, without you, the audience, we would not have had this wonderful discussion. So let me thank you all, wish you well, and remind you we start again tomorrow morning. And tomorrow evening, the SUCOB lecture. You got one journey today, or you got a combined journey. Tomorrow evening for the SUCOB lecture, we get yet another journey, the journey of Professor MacDonald. We won't give you any tips as to what is to come. You have to come and listen to the journey. Thank you all. Good night. Safe travel.